Okay. So just by way of reminder, when we look at Genesis, we are not looking at something that was written in a vacuum. Genesis had an original audience, but we still benefit from it. But we were making this point on Wednesday that through chapter 11, we are very much looking at God and His relationship to all of humanity. Now, Wednesday night, we're going to start in chapter 12 in the story of Abraham, and certainly then we have a much more honed-in focus on Abraham's family and the seed that was ultimately going to bring redemption and salvation to all of mankind. So remember again, if you're Israel, you've been rescued out of Egyptian bondage. You are now... You may know some of these things because they were passed on, but now in a fuller sense, this is all being related to you, and everything thus far this is God and His relationship to all of humanity. God is concerned for all of humanity. And so when we get to chapter 10, that of course is made clear to us because God is showing where from the descendants of Noah, from his 3 sons, all of humanity was going to spring. All the nations of the world were going to spring. Now, very quickly, again, remember that at the end of chapter 9, we had this very sordid kind of account about what happens with Noah and with his sons. And because of that, there was a curse placed on Canaan, one of Noah's grandsons. But then also, Shem was blessed from the standpoint that the Lord would be his God, and also Japheth, and this whole idea that he was going to dwell in the tents of Shem, which again has no Old Testament fulfillment that we can find, but the New Testament makes all kinds of sense because in the New Testament in Christ is bringing both Jew and Gentile together. The Jews descended from Shem, many of the Gentile nations descended from Japheth, but now in Christ, we are one. Well, we come to chapter 10, and I'm not going to go verse by verse in chapter 10. I wish I had a better map. I looked all over the place, and that was the best I could find. That's from the English Standard Study Bible. But hopefully you can see it well enough there. Again, use the QR code. I'll put that back up real quick. If you want to look at the material online, and there you can have the map as big as you want it. You can zoom in, zoom out. But the map here just does really and very quickly what we would have to do a lot of talking about to figure out where all these descendants came from, where they wound up. And it's showing you that in essence, here are where the 3 branches from Noah, where they wind up being. And so Ham's descendants very much kind of stay in that North Africa, also Palestine area. Okay, those are the descendants of Ham. Egypt is a descendant of Ham. Canaan certainly is a descendant of Ham and all the Canaanites that are listed there. Shem's descendants are kind of more in the Fertile Crescent area. So really Mesopotamia, I mean. The land between the Tigris and Euphrates, those are where the descendants of Shem would settle. And then you find Japheth's descendants going up into what would be modern-day Turkey, Asia Minor, also going further west to Greece, to Italy. So that is where his descendants are going. Okay. Now, there are a couple of notable exceptions that are found in the text. The first one, forgot this was going to be there. So this again, very broadly speaking, just kind of give you an idea of where these nations, or where many even of the modern peoples would come from. This is the idea that's being conveyed to us in Genesis chapter 10 of where the descendants of all 3, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, would come through. Okay, there are 2, however, figures that we want to give particular attention to. So there's this one figure in verse 9. It actually starts in verse 8. This is one of the descendants of Ham. And so it says that Cush, and Cush was one of the sons of Ham, Cush fathered Nimrod. He was the first on earth to be a mighty man. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Therefore it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. The beginning of his kingdom was Babel, Erech, Akkad, and Calneh in the land of Shinar. From that land he went into Assyria and built Nineveh, Rehoboth-ir, Calah, and Rezin between Nineveh and Calah. That is the great city. Okay. The reason why we want to just point him out, and I know we're getting into chapter 9 a little bit, but when you look at the map, okay, we are going to be centering our attention here in Babylon, that is Babel, but also other cities that are attributed to Nimrod are here, Akkad, Erech, Nineveh, Calah. All those cities are attributed to Nimrod. So again, Nimrod and his family don't initially go to these areas, but he, a descendant of Ham, goes in these areas and founds this kingdom, if you will, founds these cities. And he is described as a mighty man, as a warrior that goes out and does this. So I'm just pointing that out because one of those cities is going to be where our attention is drawn to in chapter 11. The other figure that I want to point out is what it says in verse 21. To Shem also, the father of all the children of Eber. Eber is brought to our attention immediately. Even though Eber is not going to be a son of Shem, he's a great-grandson of Shem. But it's through him, and we'll see this in chapter 11, it's through this descendant of Shem that the Israelites will descend, that Abraham's family is going to come from. So when we get to the end of chapter 10, we're starting to make this bridge. God's care and concern for all the nations. He is God of all the nations. But we're starting to hone in on this family that God is going to use to bring the Messiah into the world that would then ultimately bless all the nations. And that's all I wanted to share on chapter 10. Anybody, anything else on chapter 10? Yes? I don't know that there are necessarily historical records of Nimrod. I might be wrong about that. Or that may even be a name given for another founder, conqueror that maybe is just not the same biblical name. I don't know that for sure, but perhaps. Steve?
I've always heard that Eber is basically the root word that Hebrew comes from.
I believe that's correct.
That's the origin of it. So
yeah.
When you talk about Eber, you're talking about the Hebrews.
Yes. If you didn't hear, Eber is basically the root for Hebrew. So when you talk about the Hebrew peoples, and by the way, Israelites, therefore, would not be the only Hebrew people. They would, there's many descendants that come from Eber. They would all be, quote-unquote, Hebrews, but Israelites are certainly the ones that we associate with the term Hebrew. All right. Well, that's chapter 10. I didn't think we would spend just a ton of time in chapter 10, but I want to go to chapter 11. Now, the events of chapter 11, most likely it would seem, occur before Nimrod. In fact, there was one descendant of Shem that's mentioned in verse 25. To Eber were born two sons. The name of the one was Peleg, for in his days the earth was divided. Now, we don't know exactly what that means, but it may very well indicate it was in the days of Peleg that chapter 11 occurs, that the Tower of Babel, where the people are ultimately divided into their nationalities and languages they all come from. You will note at the conclusion of each one of these genealogies of these sons, it will talk about how they all spread out. So, for instance, verse 5, talking about the sons of Japheth. From these, the coastland peoples spread in their lands, each with his own language, by their clans and their nations. Same thing is said about Ham in verse 20. These are the sons of Ham by their clans, their languages, their lands, and their nations. And again in verse 31, the sons of Shem by their clans, their languages, their lands, and their nations. So chapter 10 is taking us further in time, talking about when all these people spread out. And it says they spread out by their languages, by their lands, by their nations. But then when we get to chapter 11, that hasn't happened yet. The spreading out hasn't happened yet because when we get to chapter 11, everybody has the same language. Okay. So, starting in chapter 11, the whole earth had one language and the same words. And as people migrated from the east, they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. So again, this plain of Shinar is this really entire region here where Babylon is located. Again, these other cities that Nimrod would found are also in this area. This is the plain of Shinar. So they said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly." And they had brick for stone and bitumen for mortar. And they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens. And let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth." Okay. Now, we are going to get to the part in the story where, of course, God does not want this to happen. And God is going to take extraordinary measures to make sure this doesn't happen. But let's just focus on what they say. What's the problem? What's the issue here? Or maybe issues, we should say.
One of the issues is that God had told them to go and multiply the earth in Genesis, the 8th chapter, and their response was, "No, we're going to stay here and identify with each other."
Yes. Okay, so Steve brought out that this is a blatant violation of God's command. You referenced chapter 8, I'll reference chapter 9. God says to his people, to Noah and those who come out of the ark in verse 7, "Be fruitful and multiply, increase greatly on the earth and multiply in it." Maybe I should have used the one that you mentioned, Steve, because what verse were you looking at? Verse 17, "May swarm on the earth, be fruitful and multiply on the earth." So this point that they were to go out, to spread through the earth, to multiply. So they are looking at not doing that. We're going to stay together. Okay, so there is a violation of the will of God. What else would you find in their attitude and in their statement? Okay, as opposed to what? Okay, we're not the people of God. We're going to make a name for ourselves. You know, we want to make sure that we are prominent. Michelle, was that what you were going to say? Okay. So absolutely, maybe some discontentment there too. You know, they're not happy with what God wants for them. So we're going to do this, take things into our own hands. Yes, Megan.
I don't actually know if this has any consequence, but I just think it's interesting. In one of my classes, my teacher mentioned how bitumen, which is the stuff that they use in between, is also the same kind of stuff like that was in pit that Noah used on the ark.
Okay. Oh, because since the substances are similar, maybe. That's an interesting point. I hadn't thought of that. The picture that's on the left-hand side, this is a ziggurat. This is one of the ones that was known in Babylonian history. And the point being that they said this ziggurat would bridge heaven and earth. So this may, in fact, be an echo of the same biblical story, just like the Babylonians would retain flood stories, as DK pointed out and did a good job. So many of these cultures have had flood stories really throughout the earth. Well, there's a similar story in Babylonian. But the ziggurat was, and if you can't, you may not be able to see it there, and again, if you go online, you'd be able to see it a lot better. It's a notable structure. Now, at the bottom of that, it gives you an idea of how this structure would have compared to the Great Pyramid at Giza. Not nearly as big, but still, this is a massive structure. Does anybody know what was the purpose of a ziggurat in these cultures? Jared?
Like mimic a mountain or something?
Yeah, so you're trying to ascend to heaven. It is mimicking a mountain in that way. And what's at the top?
Their gods, they thought their gods were in higher places than lower places.
Yes. So you would have it, Kenny? Yeah, so at the top is where you'd have your temple. And that, because you make it as high as you can, and then your God would come down to you there and meet with you, and you would offer your sacrifices there at the very top of this ziggurat. That may be what's intended in this story. Even when they say, we'll reach up into heaven, yes, it's making a name for ourselves, but it's not necessarily that they're leaving God exclusively out of the picture. No, we're going to do this for God. We're going to go up, and there we'll meet with God. Okay? Again, can't be sure because the text does not say that. But given what we see archaeologically, that could be what they were looking at doing. All right, so let's get to God's response then. So this is an interesting play on words. They say, we're going to go up. All right, we're going to build this city and this temple, and we're going to go up into heaven. What's the first thing God says? Let's go down. We're going to go down. Okay? So the jump, it's already God saying, yeah, this is pitiful. Because you're trying this, but I'm going to do this. You're trying to ascend to heaven, but come, let us go down. Okay? Now, let's notice what God says. Thank you. And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the children of man had built. And the Lord said, behold, they are one people, and they have all one language, and this is only the beginning of what they will do. And nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them. Let's talk about that for a minute. What do you think is God's concern here? That they're going to ultimately be, they stay together, they're going to be technologically superior, they're going to overthrow me. Is that what his concern is? Remember, yeah, Luke?
Would it be that they would become so self-reliant that they wouldn't feel the need for God?
I think that may be part of it. So in their self-reliance, they don't feel the need for God. That's a lot better solution than God's worried about them. Because remember, God just destroyed the entire earth with water. It's not as if God can't undo anything that he wants to. Okay? That's one. What else?
In the material, we talked about the fact that it would threaten God's plan for them, for mankind.
Yeah. So we'll come back to that in just a second.
When it says that whatever they propose, nothing will be impossible for them, I don't think it means that they can do anything. It's just that since they can do this one thing, why not try all these other things that God doesn't want?
Yeah. I agree. I see that. Kenny?
There's another play on words here, which is make a name for ourselves. And the word play is, that word is Shem. That make a
Name.
for ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
Which is their name. And really it's that, you're kind of alluding to that self-reliance. And it's the near of self-reliance. And they're reaching up to God to basically get to God. And God is already down there with them. And basically what they're doing is they are coming to God on their terms, not having God come down to them on his terms. And they're making basically an idol of basically who God is.
Yeah.
They are going to dictate what God is going to do for them.
Yeah. I think all these are involved here. Going with the big picture of what the story's telling us, though, this is kind of where I side is God's main concern here. Remember when we get to the flood? What is it that happened that ultimately led to the flood? Okay, man had been wicked, all the way back to, Adam and Eve sin in the garden, then Cain, their son, kills his brother. So there had been wickedness among men, but there had been a line from Seth that called on the name of the Lord. But then we get to chapter 6, what do we read? And I know there's some questions about that. What is this whole idea of the sons of God marrying the daughters of men? I take it to mean that God's line that was being faithful to Him is now intermarrying with the rest of the people, and now they've all become wicked. Well, God looks at this and says, what's going to happen when all of humanity just stays right there together? What's going to happen when I've said the seed of woman is ultimately going to come and bruise the head of the serpent? That seed, that line, isn't going to last if they all stick together. I see that as being God's main concern here, because what you have immediately following this is God separating that line out from the midst of sin and iniquity, and we'll talk more about that here when we get to chapter 12 in particular. I think, to me, that's what God's biggest concern is, but I think all the things that you said have application and fit in here as well. Yeah?
You had mentioned this idea of a godly offspring, and it seems appropriate to me in Malachi 2:17. At the close of the Old Testament, they are reminded that God expected and desired. It says in verse 17 of Malachi, it says, "But did He not make them one having a remnant of the Spirit? And why one? He seeks godly offspring. Therefore take heed to your spirit, and let none deal treacherously with wife of youth."
Mm-hmm.
That He closes this dispensation with God is still desiring godly offspring.
Yeah.
Just like He was at the beginning.
I agree. I think that's a really good point. If you didn't hear Malachi 2:17, God's concern for the godly offspring, even at the conclusion of the Old Testament record. You had that beginning of the Old Testament, concluding the Old Testament. I think there's a point there as well. All right. So what we know God's solution is He confuses their languages. And because of that, they're going to spread out. They're going to do exactly what God said. So on the surface, chapter 11 serves that purpose for us. It lets us know, okay, here's how the different languages came to be. Here is why the different nations exist and why they went to the various parts of the earth where they went. But there's something else here too. I thought I had that coming in point by point, but okay, it's all there. All right. This is an episode where man is trying to enforce his will over the will of God. We're going to do this. We're going to build this tower. We're going to stretch into heaven. We're not going to be separated. This is us. And God thwarts that plan on every hand. So they are going to build a tower in a city. God causes them to abandon the city. They wanted to avoid being scattered. They are scattered. They aim to build a tower that could reach into the heavens. God's the one who comes down in judgment. They want to make a name for themselves. Well, there's a name that has come throughout history, and that is the name of Babel. It does not mean confusion, but the word for confusion in the text there is Balal. So it's it's a play on words. Babel sounds like Balal. Okay, so that's the name. We know that name even today from this story. Well, that's not the name they were intending for themselves, but that's the name they have based on this. And then this is significant, I think, because I think there's a reason in chapter 10 Nimrod is given focus. And when we get to chapter 11, this happens at Babel. So again, remember Nimrod and his kingdom, which hasn't happened yet. He's going to found cities at Babel, at Nineveh, at all these places, okay? Now, this is being written after Israel has left Egypt. Is Babylon and Assyria even on their radar? No. This is about 1400 BC. The Assyrians take Israel captive in about 720 BC. So we're 700 years away. And then Babylon will destroy the temple in Jerusalem in 586 BC. But right here, God started pointing at, here's where these things came from. And these, and particularly Babylon, throughout Scripture, is given as the people that reject God, reject His ways. Okay? Revelation, which I firmly believe is written about Rome, written about what Rome was doing to Christians, and yet what is the name given for the city that oppresses and opposes God in Revelation? It's Babylon. Okay? So that goes all the way back here to Genesis 11. Okay? This is where man tried to resist God. And now in Old Testament and in New Testament, here's the people that are still trying to resist God. Now, with that, go over to these passages real quick. Let's go over to Isaiah. And chapter 47 talks about God's, what He was going to do to Babylon. And remember, the setting of Isaiah is Babylonian captivity is coming. It hasn't happened yet. God's people, the Israelites, have been faithless. So God is going to bring punishment on them. He's going to use the Babylonians. But God also gives hope. Here's what's going to happen to Babylon. They're going to be brought low. So He says, beginning in verse 1 of chapter 47 of Isaiah, "Come down, sit in the dust, O virgin daughter of Babylon. Sit on the ground without a throne, O daughter of the Chaldeans. For you shall no more be called tender and delicate." And he goes on to give this picture of judgment on her. Now skip over to chapter 48. And notice what it says in verse 20. This is talking to God's people who are going to be oppressed by the Babylonians. Now God is showing, okay, here's what's going to happen to Babylon. And He says, verse 20, "Go out from Babylon. Flee from Chaldea. Declare this with a shout of joy. Proclaim it. Send it out to the end of the earth. Say, the Lord has redeemed His servant Jacob." Okay? So their redemption comes with going out from Babylon. They are leaving Babylon. Now I'll go over to Revelation. Revelation chapter 18. And again, in Revelation, Babylon is the city that has rejected God, that is opposed to God. And in chapter 18, God is showing, okay, I will punish Babylon. I'm going to bring my will against her. And so the voice comes in verse 2 of chapter 18 and says, "Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. She has become a dwelling place for demons, a haunt for every unclean spirit, a haunt for every unclean bird, a haunt for every unclean and detestable beast." And again, it goes on to talk about her judgment. But then, verse 4, "I heard another voice from heaven saying, 'Come out of her. Come out of her, my people, lest you take part in her sins, lest you share in her plagues.'" Okay, so, going back to Genesis, here's where we're first introduced to Babylon. They oppose God. God brings it to nothing. But this city will continue to oppose God. In every instance in the future when they have opposed God, God is saying to His people, you come out. You come out from Babylon. Okay? Old Testament, New Testament, come out from her. Go back to my map real quick. What's down here that's pretty significant when we get to chapter 12? And of course, Haran is up here. Okay? This is this entire region, again, where Nimrod had gone and established his kingdom back in chapter 10. And we get to chapter 12, what did God say to Abram? Go out. Okay? You're going out. So Abraham was the first, you might say, to leave, not Babylon specifically, but to leave this entire area which was devoted to idolatry, which is devoted to all kinds of sinful things. Okay? And I might be making a stretch there, but I think that may be what God is alluding to even in Isaiah 48, Revelation 18. I have promises for my people. I have blessings for my people. You have to go out. Go out from Babylon. Go out from that area. All right. That's what I've got on the Tower of Babel. Yeah, Gary?
Sorry to go back, man, but it's so interesting to me, the logic and mindset of the people there at the end of verse 4, where it says, so that we may make a name for ourselves. And then I think a very interesting word there is used, otherwise we will be scattered over the face of the whole earth. I mean, we've kind of talked about maybe why they really wanted to stay in one place, but it's almost like with the use of that word otherwise, they're scared to be scattered for some reason. And it's just like they think they're going to be, their power is going to be dwindled from them if they are scattered.
Yeah.
It's an interesting mindset and use of
Well,
logic.
to that point, though, that would indicate lack of faith, because if God is the one who said, multiply, fill the earth, all right, let's have faith that God's going to be with us. To your point, if they are scared, okay, well, they don't have faith in God. We've got to protect ourselves. Steve?
And I've always seen in this that God told them to go and populate the earth and scatter. And their response is, no, we're going to stay here. Jesus tells his disciples to go into all the world and preach the gospel. And in the conversion in Acts, the 2nd chapter, they are content to have a big giant church in Jerusalem and stay where they are.
Yeah.
And what does God do?
Scatters them.
He sends Saul to persecute them. And in Acts the 8th chapter it says, and that those who were scattered went preaching the word everywhere. God's going to get his will accomplished.
Interesting.
But man has to go kicking and screaming. And
Yeah.
I think there's a contrast between these two, that God's will is going to be done.
I agree. Michelle?
Just looking at it a different way, and I don't know if it's going to come, but when I read it, I think of stubbornness or defiance.
Sure. Absolutely.
Rather than fear. You know, this is the way we like it, and this is the way we're going to do it.
Yeah. Both, either or, are still a lack of faith. Whether you're being stubborn against the will of God or you're doing this out of fear, you're not putting faith. All right. A couple of New Testament tie-ins here. All right, you're familiar with Jesus, and of course, well, I think we're all familiar with Jesus somewhat. Okay. So we know in the Gospels, which, by the way, there are how many Gospels, Scott? There are 4 Gospels. That's a great number. 4 Gospels, okay. So in the Gospels, Jesus sends out ambassadors and emissaries to go and preach. Now we know he sends the 12 out, but on another occasion he sends out how many? Who remembers? 70. Why 70? Maybe that's just the number of the disciples he had on hand. Again, this may be a stretch. There are 70 peoples or nations mentioned in chapter 10. So is that a parallel there? Perhaps. Don't know. But it's one of those interesting things. Much more significant is this. Okay. In the Tower of Babel, God confuses the language. God separates man based on language. But you get to Acts chapter 2 and God reverses it. God sends His Spirit on the apostles so they can then proclaim the gospel in every language. And what do you have in chapter 2? The people who have come together on the day of Pentecost, who have come from the nation. And I should have done that. Take a map, find a map of Acts 2, the nations represented at Pentecost. Take it, compare it with a map from Acts chapter 10. You're looking at the same peoples. You're looking at the same nations represented. And they're all together on the day of Pentecost, and now God unifies them through the Spirit, proclaiming the gospel, proclaiming the good news in the languages they can hear. All right, I've got to move on because I really don't want to have any of chapter 11 left when we get into chapter 12 on Wednesday night. So just moving on. All right, so you have in verses 10 through 26, you have the descendants of Shem given again. And that's because now God is honing in on the family that was going to bring the Messiah into the world. Tracing that back to chapter 3 and verse 15 where God said, a seed of woman is going to bruise the head of the serpent. we're looking at, okay, where does that seed come from? Now, Shem's descendants had already been given back in chapter 10, but there is a notable difference here. In chapter 10, you get to Eber, which is found in both, and you get to his sons, Peleg and Joktan. Peleg is the one who is under consideration in chapter 11, and his brother was the one under consideration in chapter 10. But the significant thing is what it says in verse 26. When Terah had lived 70 years, he fathered Abram, Nahor, and Haran. And that then gets us into Terah's family. Now, when we get to chapter 12 and the call to Abraham, that call in the Genesis record happens while they're at Haran. Significantly, though, the inspired account in Acts chapter 7, when Stephen is going back through Israelite history, when did Abraham first receive the call from God? And they're in Ur of the Chaldeans. So chapter 11 talks about their move from Ur to Haran, and then chapter 12 gives us that call that Abraham would receive for the second time when they're in Haran, but he's already received it once. Now, here's what we don't know. We do not know if Terah had also heard the call and he's starting to make the move, because the text does say their intent was to go to Canaan. That would be, well, there we are in verse 31. When it talks about how Terah took his son Abram and Lot, the son of Haran, and Sarai, his daughter-in-law, and they went from Ur of the Chaldeans to go into the land of Canaan, but when they came to Haran, they settled there. And by the way, if you're thinking, wow, they're making a long trip to go from Ur to ultimately here, why wouldn't you just go straight through here? Yeah, it's the Arabian desert. I mean, you can go watch Lawrence of Arabia and fall asleep and get some context of why you wouldn't necessarily want to do that, or just, it's the Arabian desert. Okay, you don't travel through the Arabian desert. So what you do is you would travel 600 miles to here, and then it's going to be another 400 miles to here. But they do make this first step of the journey, the first stage of the journey. Now again, we don't know what is Terah's mindset. What we do know from inspired record, Joshua 24 and verse 2, Joshua said to the people, "Long ago your fathers lived beyond the Euphrates, Terah, the father of Abraham and of Nahor, and they served other gods." Both Ur and Haran, the predominant worship was of the moon god Sin. Of course, a host of other gods would have been worshipped there as well. But Terah does not leave. Now, again, is that willful? Just decides I don't want to go? Is that a matter of health because he does die in Haran? I don't know. But Abraham is going to have to leave. He cannot stay in Mesopotamia. I'm trying to think. I know because the second bell is going to ring here in a second. We can tie in some of this into chapter 12, but just making sure there's nothing really major that I wanted to. Well, we'll just make this point. Okay. So going back to the Tower of Babel, of course, okay, Babylon, and again, that stands for the oppressor of God's people throughout time. Going back to the very end of Scripture, Babylon is judged. And then we get to Revelation 21 and 22. What are we having described for us in Revelation 21 and 22? The holy city, the new Jerusalem, and where does that Jerusalem come from? Comes down from heaven, okay? Again, kind of, God says, let us go down. Babylon falls, the new city comes down. And of course, what does the Hebrew writer, in speaking of Abram's faith, say about Abraham and why he was going to Canaan? What was he hoping to find? What was he looking to find? A city whose builder was God. So again, throughout Scripture, you just find these ideas being tied back together. Abraham is leaving. For what? He does not know. But he has hope. He has faith. We'll get more into that on Wednesday night. I'll try to tie all this in together a little bit better. Final questions, comments? Yeah, Kenny?
Bill Roberts used to make the point that when you look at the city of God, man cities are almost always testimonies to themselves. That we have the Lincoln Memorial, we have the Jefferson Memorial, we have the Empire State Building, and they are great monuments to who we are. But when you look at the city of God, it's the garden, and that God's city is basically the garden that we have in Genesis 1.
Yeah. I mean, again, that's absolutely, because we are tying it all back. We're going back again to God's intent for man being with him. All right, thank you, everybody. I think they're lining up in the back, so we'll go ahead and conclude. We will take Genesis chapter 12 on Wednesday.